Chapter 1. It was close to midnight when the single rider reined in his horse outside the small cottage set in the trees below Castle Redmont. The laden pack-pony trailing behind the saddle-horse ambled to a halt as well. The rider, a tall man who moved with the easy grace of youth, swung down from the saddle and stepped up onto the narrow veranda, stooping to avoid the low-lying eaves. From the lean-to at the stable at the side of the house came the sound of a gentle nickering as his own horse's head rose in answer to greeting. The rider had raised his fist to knock on the door when he saw a light come on behind the curtained windows. He hesitated. The light moved across the room, and, a second or so later, the door opened before him. "Gillen," Holt said, without any note of surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The young ranger laughed incredulously as he faced his former teacher. "How do you do it, Holt?" he asked. "How could you possibly know it was me arriving in the middle of the night, before you even opened the door?" Holt shrugged, gesturing for Gillen to enter the house. He closed the door behind him and moved to the neat little kitchen, opening the dampening vent on the stove and sending new life flaring into the wood coals inside. He tossed a handful of kindling into the stove and set a copper kettle on the hot plate over the fire chamber, shaking it first to make sure there was plenty of water in it. "I heard your horse some minutes ago," he said finally. "Then, when I heard Abelard call a greeting, I knew it had to be a ranger horse." He shrugged again. "Simple when you explained it," the gesture said. Gillen laughed again in reply. "Well, that narrowed it down to 50 people, didn't it?" he said. Holt cocked his head to one side with a pitying look. "Gillen, I must have heard you stumbling up that front step 1,000 times when you were studying with me," he said. "Give me credit for recognizing the sound once more." The younger ranger spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. He unclasped his cloak and hung it over the back of the chair, moving a little closer to the stove. It was a chilly night, and he watched Holt measuring coffee into a pot with some anticipation. The door to the rear room of the house opened, and Will entered the small living room, his clothes pulled on hastily over his nightshirt, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Evening, Gillen," he said casually. "What brings you here?" Gillen looked from one to the other in something like despair. "Isn't anybody surprised when I turn up in the middle of the night?" he asked, of no one in particular. Holt, busy by the stove, turned away to hide a grin. A few minutes later he'd heard Will moving hurriedly to the window as the horses drew near to the cottage. Obviously his apprentice had overheard Holt's exchange with Gillen, and was doing his best to emulate his own casual approach to the unexpected arrival. However, knowing Will as he did, Holt was sure the boy was bursting with curiosity over the reason for Gillen's sudden appearance. He decided he'd call his bluff. "It's late, Will," he said. "You might as well go back to bed. We have a busy day tomorrow." Instantly, Will's nonchalant expression was replaced by a stricken look. The suggestion from his master was tantamount to an order. All thought of appearing casual departed instantly. "Oh, please, Holt!" the boy exclaimed. "I want to know what's going on." Holt and Gillen exchanged a quick grin. Will was actually hopping from one foot to the other as he waited for Holt to rescind the suggestion that he go back to bed. The grizzled ranger kept a straight face as he set 3 steaming mugs of coffee on the kitchen table. "Just as well I made 3 cups then, isn't it?" he said, and Will realized that he had been having his leg pulled. He shrugged, grinning, and sat down with his 2 seniors. "Very well, Gillen. Before my apprentice explodes with curiosity, what is the reason for this unexpected visit?" "Well, it has to do with those battle plans you discovered last week. Now that we know what Morgarath has in mind, the king wants the army ready for the plains of Uthal before the dark of the next moon. That's when Morgarath plans to break through Three-Step Pass." The captured document had told them a great deal. Morgarath's plan called for 500 Scandian mercenaries to make their way through the swamps and fenlands and attack the Aurelian garrison at Three-Step Pass. With the pass undefended, Morgarath's main army of Wargals would be able to break out and deploy into battle order on the plains. "So Duncan plans to beat him to the punch," Holt said, nodding slowly. "Good thinking. That way we control the battlefield." Will nodded in his turn and said in an equally grave voice, "And we'll keep Morgarath's army bottled up in the pass." Gillen turned slightly to hide a grin. He wondered if he had tried to copy Halt's mannerisms when he was an apprentice, and decided he probably had. On the contrary, he said, once the army's in place, Duncan plans to withdraw the garrison, then fall back to prepared positions and let Morgarath out onto the plains. Let him out? Will's voice went up in pitch with surprise. Is the king crazy? Why would... He realized that both rangers were looking at him. Holt with one eyebrow raised, and Gillen with a quizzical smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I mean, he hesitated, not sure if questioning the king's sanity might constitute treason. No offense or anything like that. It's just... Oh, I'm sure the king wouldn't be offended to hear that a lowly apprentice ranger thought he was crazy, said Holt. Kings usually love to hear that sort of thing. But Holt, to let him out after all these years, it seems... He was about to say crazy again, but thought better of it. He thought suddenly of his recent encounter with the Wargals. The idea of thousands of those vile beasts streaming unstopped out of the pass made his blood run cold. It was Holt who answered first. That's just the point, Will. After all these years. We've spent 16 years looking over our shoulders at Morgarath, wondering what he's been up to. In that time, we've had many of our forces tied up patrolling the base of the cliffs and keeping watch over Three Step. And he's been free to strike us at any time he likes. The Kalkara were the latest example, as you know only too well. Gillen glanced admiringly at his former teacher. Holt had instantly seen the reasoning behind the king's plan. Not for the first time he understood why Holt was one of the king's most respected advisers. He's right, Will, he said. And there's another reason. After 16 years of relative peace, people are growing complacent. Not the rangers, of course, but the village people who provide men-at-arms for our army, and even some of the barons and battle-masters in remote fiefs to the north. You've seen for yourself how reluctant people are to leave their farms and go to war, Holt put in. Will nodded. He and Holt had spent the last week traveling to outlying villages in Redmount Fife to raise the levies of men who would make up the bulk of the army. On more than one occasion they had been met with outright hostility. Hostility that melted away as Holt exerted the full force of his personality and reputation. As far as King Duncan is concerned, now is the time to settle this, Gillen continued. We're as strong as we'll ever be, and any delay would only weaken us. This is the best opportunity we'll have to rid of Morgarath once and for all. All of which still begs my original question, Holt said. What brings you here in the middle of the night? Orders from Crowley, Gillen said crisply. He placed a written dispatch on the table, and Holt, after an inquiring look at Gillen, unrolled it and read it. Crowley was the commandant of the Rangers, Will knew, the most senior of all the 50 Rangers in the Corps. Holt read, then rolled the orders closed again. So you're taking dispatches to King Swynet of the Celts, he said. I assume you're invoking the mutual defense treaty that Duncan signed with him some years ago. Gillen nodded, sipping appreciatively at the fragrant coffee. The king feels we're going to need all the troops we can muster. Holt nodded thoughtfully. I can't find his fault in thinking there, he said softly. But... He spread his hands in a questioning gesture. If Gillen were taking dispatches to Celtica, the sooner he got on with it, the better, the gesture seemed to say. Well, said Gillen, it's an official embassy to Celtica. He laid a little stress on the last word, and suddenly Holt nodded his understanding. Of course, he said, the old Celtic tradition. Superstition, more like it, Gillen answered, shaking his head. It's a ridiculous waste of time as far as I'm concerned. Of course it is, Holt replied, but the Celts insist on it, so what can you do? Will looked from Holt to Gillen and back again. The two rangers seemed to understand what they were talking about. To Will, they might as well have been speaking Espinard. It's all very well in normal times, Gillen said, but with all these preparations for war, we're stretched thin in every area. We simply don't have the people to spare. So Crowley thought. I think I'm ahead of you, Holt said, and finally Will could bear it no longer. Well, I'm way behind you, he burst out. What on earth are you two talking about? Are you speaking Araluan? And not some strange foreign tongue that just sounds like it? But it makes no sense at all.